Okay. Recording in progress. Okay. All right. So we got Into the Absurd. This is episode 62, I believe. And I have a special guest today. This is Ben Morris. I met him in high school. Welcome.
Welcome to be here, dude. It's good finally talking again and shit.
Yeah.
It's fun. Yeah, I'm excited.
Yeah, this will be cool. So how did you get into this subject on like capitalist realism?
Let's see. It was kind of like a meme sort of image that circulated around like a kind of ecosystem of like Instagram pages that just kind of like call themselves Theorygram, but they just kind of like meme about like post-structuralist and stuff and kind of prescient political philosophy. And they talk about capitalist realism a lot, and it's only 90 pages, so I was like, hell yeah. That's
Okay.
right up my alley. And I read it, and I don't know, it left a really big impact on me, and it draws in a lot of other philosophy that I've kind of branched out on, and really got me just sort of interested in philosophy.
Cool. All right. Well, we made some. You cannot minimize Zoom when you're recording a meeting. Interesting. Okay, but I can do this. Okay. So we will be going over. This will be a two-part series on capitalist realism by Mark Fisher, which is essentially it's a book somewhere between a book and a really long essay.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah, basically just about capitalist realism, which is, well, the way that I've kind of conceptualized it while I've been reading this is that when I think of someone who's really just a negative person and you suggest something to them, they'll tell you, well, that's not realistic.
Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm. And then you're just thinking, well, but why is it not real? I mean, it's possible, isn't it?
Right.
If it's possible, then it's realistic, is it not?
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of, in my viewpoint, capitalist realism is about, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's sort of about how people who kind of proclaim that capitalism is basically the only way, they say that they're being realistic, right? In the sense that it's not even possible to do anything other than capitalism. There's nothing else that is even possibly imaginable. Like, for instance, his first chapter in this book is it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. So
yeah, that's pretty close. Like spot on to like what I think. I really think the part that should be emphasized though is that it's less of like an attitude or an ideology that people who support capitalism adopt, and more of just kind of a pervasive atmosphere in society. Just this sort of like passive societal input that kind of suggests to us that, there's a suggestive common sense in capitalism and its workings, and how, the idea that there's a sort of end of history, that like the battles between communism and fascism and capitalism all, kind of fought themselves out in the 20th century, and capitalism emerged as the victor. And it's kind of worked that notion into just kind of our structures of thought, really, via media and society and just kind of other inputs. But yeah, I think that the key point is the fact that it's just a very kind of pervasive, just like a cancellation of the future. I think Mark likes to put it is, the idea of any sort of utopian future, or even just a better future, right, that exists outside of capitalism or the current system is just unthinkable. It's impossible. We can only use the language of the previous century's battles to like conceptualize that, and that brings in its own issues. And where Deleuze kind of comes into Fisher's thought is this idea of creation in terms of concepts, right? He views philosophy as a tool for us to create concepts. We draw from what he calls a plane of immanence, which is this sort of, I don't know, like you could make, I don't know, this like divine well of, things of like potential, I guess.
Okay.
And we can, yeah, I'll let you cut in.
Well, I was going to ask, would you say it's sort of, it's this all pervasive thing, right? And would you say it's sort of like, I think he might bring this up later on, but do you think it's sort of like capitalism is the set for the Truman Show and we're all Truman, kind of?
Yeah, I think so. Well, the interesting thing is like we kind of are conditioned to think that like the camera is on us and that we are, in this like world of data and things constantly
We're being
being swirled
judged.
around us. We're being judged, right? But also to a degree, we have shifted to become like objects within capital as the subject, right? We're no longer like subjects of a society who are subject to the inputs of what it generates and reproduces. Rather, we are inputs into capital reproducing itself, right? We serve its reproductions because its ideology and logic kind of pervades our whole society. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it's sort of we're the fuel for the machine.
Yeah, you can put it like that for sure.
Yeah, I use a lot of metaphors. I'm just
yeah, that's good.
Well, it's sort of, before we jump into it, it's sort of, I think a lot of the world's problems come down to overpopulation, at least in my opinion.
You think so?
And well, by overpopulation, I mean, like, what is overpopulation? That's excessive growth, right? And what is capitalism? It's a machine that promotes, basically its goal is to promote endless growth.
Right. It depends on that. It can't function without it.
Yep, exactly.
The line has to continually go up. And when it comes down or stagnates, it can correct itself, it can right itself. But, the downfalls of that fall on the human, on us. It's just a system that continues to progress.
Yeah, it's like it's like one of those perpetual motion machines.
Right.
Or like a snowball going down a hill.
Yeah, you could say that.
Okay, let's get in. All right, let us begin.
Chapter 1.
Yeah, chapter 1. It's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. So, what did I say? All right. So Fisher brings up he brings up the example of the 2006 film Children of Men, which I actually haven't seen. Have you seen it, Ben?
Yeah, it's a great film. I need to watch it again, but it's fun. It's depressing.
Could you actually just summarize the film for us?
Yeah, so basically it's a dystopian future where by I forget if it's a virus or just some unknown thing, everybody in the world becomes infertile and there's no more reproduction. The generation that exists is the last one. And the sort of dystopian society that it depicts is, instead of like, in 1984 or Brave New World, those kind of dystopians where it's heavily state oriented, this is rather kind of a continuation of the neoliberal capitalism that we have now. Sorry.
What?
Oh shit. Yeah, there we go. I'm back. Where was I?
You said this was a continuation of the neoliberal capitalism that we've been having.
Right. So that's kind of unique in terms of a dystopian media. You don't see that a lot. And so it's useful for Fisher to kind of use it as an example of our kind of anxieties about there being no future, because that's the main part of the movie, is that there is not going to be a future that's possible. And we're suffering from that now, this sort of despondent pathology of like, this sort of depressive, like, okay, yeah, nothing else is really like possible or going to happen outside of the system. We can't even really hope to change it. In media, everything is just, kind of a replication, a sequel or a reboot, or, a safe assessment, right? Because capital has to appeal to the most consumers. And by making, rehash media, it's easy to do, and also by overvaluing nostalgia, because that's easily replicable.
So I will have to ask you here is that what would it take to change though? Because I know he brings this up later, but I personally, I think in order to actually really fundamentally change the system, there would have to be a lot of destruction, turmoil, and suffering for that to even take place.
Right. I mean, if you use the frame of the revolutions we've seen in the previous centuries, it does entail bloodshed, but also where Deleuze kind of inserts into Fisher's writing is this idea that instead of fighting that sort of battle on the material stage, we instead need to kind of wrangle people's desires and re-territorialize the sort of modes of thought that have been coded by capitalism. So just like promoting just a sort of like romanticism, I guess, about the world, a sort of like a breaking from the icy calculations that capital has ingrained into us so hard, and just kind of re-looking at life in that sort of more joyous but also serious way, right? Because it's a project and it must be carried out. You can't just sit back and just kind of spectate while you be yourself or become yourself or whatever, that kind of thing. Because also nothing changes in societies unless there's a mass. You need, like, the idea of like a great man rising to power, like that attaches onto our myths and stories well, right? The Napoleon figure, but above him standing triumphantly is sees masses of people, right? And that's the only way that change can be affected.
Yeah, you need a horde,
right? And that has a negative connotation from bourgeois media,
or the herd. Well, the herd has always had a negative connotation, especially. I know you haven't read much Nietzsche, but he talks very, very negatively about the herd.
But also Christianity loves the herd. They use the shepherd allegory all the time.
Yes, exactly.
And because truly, like, people want something to follow, right? They want some sort of structure, some sort of larger purpose, some sort of grand narrative to follow, and that's not a bad thing, right? Because what happens if in the absence of that, like, in a Nietzsche God is dead sort of sense, where those grand narratives have just been territorialized by capital and fragmented, and the borders between spaces broken down and made fluid, it's anxiety inducing, right? Because it's everything everywhere kind of all at once. We're exposed directly to the chaos of the world without a proper frame to progress through.
There's no real direction. It's kind of just well, sure, you're kind of set on a track, but as far as, like, we don't have like anything to really truly cling on to, I guess.
Right.
That makes sense.
And that's part of the pathology of capitalist realism that Marx talks about, or Fisher talks about. Just this sort of overwhelming sense of doom. It is, it's a depression. It's symptoms of depression and mental illness. As they exhibit themselves in society, it's a product of that anxiety.
Have you read Civilized to Death by Chris Ryan?
No, I did see that in the notes though, and I'm going to take a look at it for sure.
Okay. I'll talk about it another time. But so I have this note: capitalism can coexist with totalitarianism. Then you say that capitalism is totalitarian.
Yeah. I mean, I make that distinction because totalitarianism specifically, as opposed to like authoritarianism, involves like the total invasion of the state or whatever apparatus of control there is into your life, right? You're constantly thinking about the state. You're constantly, there's a constant stream of thoughts based around that. And what does capital and its tendrils do besides that? Everything we think about is in terms of exchange. Everything we interact with, everything we engage with, everything, the ideas that we form our thoughts with are informed all by the sort of reproductive structures of capital, right? And so that exists within us on a political level, on a national level, on a societal level, on a personal, like on a biopolitics level as well, with mental illnesses.
Yeah, it's sort of like this, like, all-encompassing force that kind of just pervades through all aspects of our lives.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think about how much something is going to cost all the time whenever I do anything. I think, man, like, how much is that going to cost? I think it's all numbers. Like everything that you buy, it all comes out of your bank. Like every time I buy something, right. I'm not going to lie to you. I look at my bank account. I go straight to my app. I look at it.
Right. Yeah. That's not an abnormal thing to do. But
yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, it is just really an all-invasive sort of thing. Even like in my classes where we talk about climate change, we discuss like possible alternatives and stuff. Like I took a geography of energy resources class that I really liked, and we would talk about that a lot. And half of the conversation was people bringing up the issue of cost, right? Just immediately out the gate. Nobody's an economist, just making speculations and immediately shutting down ideas and avenues of potential and thought with cost benefit analyses, right? And that's just like a reflexive thing that's we've been ingrained with, right? But it's the future of humanity in the world, right? And the fact that it's being stunted by this sort of thinking is, part of the crisis that we're in.
Well, Ben, it's just not realistic.
Yeah. Well, we have to, if we think about it hard enough, it'll be realistic.
Okay. So Fisher, he makes the claim that in this, going back to children or men, that infertility is basically a metaphor for the fact that, like, in capitalism, we can't really produce anything new. It's all just the old stuff that keeps coming back. Because the thing is, people don't like change. And so people don't want to buy change, right? They want to buy the same old shit that...
And nobody wants to sell change either. That's the key part, is that selling change is risky. And capitalists, as much as they talk about risk and, throwing yourself out there, they don't like to make risks. That's why, culture has become so reproductive. And
And he says instead of looking for the next big thing, people want the last big thing.
It's a prepackaged form of thought and aesthetic that you can just attach yourself to. You don't have to be involved in the creation of it at all. It's easy.
Exactly. Okay, and then what did you say? He says tradition counts for nothing when it is no longer tested and modified. A culture that is merely preserved is no culture at all. Right? Because if your culture isn't tested, if it's not modified, then, like, what is it? Right? It's nothing. And that kind of reminds me of modern day discourse. People can't talk to each other without their head exploding off, right? Like, I know these two people, I won't tell you who they are, but they go on Facebook, and one of them's very liberal and the other one's very conservative, right? And they will just argue their freaking heads off, and neither of them have, but both of them have good points, but neither of them really even listen at all to the other person. They just sort of, here it basically goes through one ear like out the other, and then they just say yeah whatever, and then they like put words in the other person's mouths, and yeah, it's just like people can't be tested anymore, and with them not being able to be tested anymore, like are they these things that they're doing, like worshiping the donkey or the elephant, this is it's basically a pseudo religious thing instead of this intellectual thing, at least in my opinion. And that's sort of how capitalism has become, in the sense that we're sort of worshiping it and we're not really trying to challenge it, if that makes sense.
Right. Yeah. And I think a big part of that too is when people kind of adopt these worldviews, it becomes a part of their identity, like any other brand, a piece of clothing that you wear or a product that you use. It's just this sort of constellation of things orbiting around you that make up yourself, or at least that's how you constitute yourself under capitalism. And then so a challenge to your worldview or ideology is a challenge to yourself. There's no disconnect between worldviews and self. And even in the end too, because you mentioned worshiping the donkey and the elephant, they both sides of the kind of Overton window within America serve the same people. The corporate elite at the top.
Exactly.
All the policies are for them and not for us, and we are just soldiers in the culture war of division and conquering that they've created so diligently.
Yep, exactly. It's there's two parties for one reason: to divide and conquer. So then okay, so this is kind of, I had a pretty good example here. He says, quote, "No cultural object can retain its power when there are no longer eyes to see it." Okay. And then he brings up the example of a Picasso painting in the film Children of Men being just a mere wall hanging. It's not really important because like no one looks at it, right?
Yeah.
So everything in society, it's transforming into nothing but like museum pieces, like relics. They're just like there, right? And in capitalist realism, it exemplifies the fact that everything in history can be assigned monetary value. There. And then he says, quote, "The beliefs of previous cultures are objectively ironized, transformed into artifacts." Okay. So then I bring up this example in the notes. I was at breakfast with my mom and dad, and there was this painting of a barn on the wall. And my mom says, "Man, I bet Cammie would really love that painting. I wonder how much it is." And then I said, "Mom, I don't think that painting's for sale." And then she said, "Oh, honey, everything's for sale."
Right. Yeah.
I'm just thinking, oh my God. And then like a few days later, I started talking to you about like all this, and I started reading this essay, and I'm thinking, holy crap. Yeah, you're right. Everything is for sale, Mom. In this, yeah, she's 100% correct. Everything is just an object that's for sale, basically. So
yeah, it's interesting. It's funny she said that too. Obviously, she wasn't going to offer the owner, money for the painting, I bet, but
no,
just the fact that that's a sort of axiom of the society we've internalized, right? We just know it's, we're educated. We know how the system works.
So it says, "Running out of time. This meeting will end in 10 minutes. Upgrade now to remove the 40-minute time." Okay. This cool. Is honestly perfect.
The
perfect.
Agora has been commoditized.
This is so perfect.
All that's common. That's funny.
Okay, let me just buy our time to talk to each other on Zoom real quick. Okay, what is this for? Please confirm your date of birth. Okay. Sorry, I'll cut most of this part out, but
yeah, give them your data. They need it. Please, please, Greg, confirm your data for us. Then you can keep talking. shut up until then.
Yeah, I feel like I'm getting held ransom. You can't continue your podcast, Greg, until you give me all your information. What's your first name, your last name, your email? Okay. Sorry.
No worries, man. It probably were too if we just hung up and then recalled or something. I feel like I've done that before.
This will be easier because then I can just, it'll all be in one recording and then I won't have to but like you can do whatever while I'm doing this.
Cool. No worries. I'm just chilling. Am I coming off as a sane person, or am I just rambling?
No, you sound like you know your shit. Yeah, you sound like you know your shit for sure. Yeah, you should be. If you were a professor, you'd be pretty good. I feel like
you teach a course on capitalist realism.
Yeah, you probably could. This isn't for educators. If you're signing up on behalf of school, no.
We ain't educators, we're consumers. Thank you very much.
Well, educators are consumers too.
Consuming your Zoom product.
There's nothing I would rather do, Ben, than consume. You know what I should do? Well, I was thinking when you get back, if you want, I would honestly be down to like drive to Bozeman and just check it out and do one in person.
Oh yeah. Yeah, dude, that'd be fun.
It's not that far.
Bozeman. No, it's like 6 hours. It's an easy drive. It's a nice one too.
Yeah, it'd be a fun little, I'd come up on Friday night, swing through Saturday, and then we'd do that.
Dope. Yeah, I'll let you know when I'm back in town. Be like,
sounds good.
Like beginning of June-ish.
Okay. Dope. Sounds good. I think my uncle's swinging through my mom's work. Well, I'm at my mom's work right now. Podcast.
If you need to take off now too, that's cool with me.
Oh no, I don't need to take off.
Word.
No, I might need to say hi to my uncle if he comes in, but
no worries.
Or maybe that might actually just be some random dude paying his rent. I don't really know. Oh yeah, that's just some random dude paying his rent. Never mind. I thought it was my uncle. Okay. Incorrect email or password? You fucking cunts.
What the hell?
John Hustoft, 1998. Maybe I used a period. What the fuck? Enter your sign-in information again. Request email. What the fuck? Pod. Maybe I'll just sign in with Google. There we
go. Thanks, Google.
There we go. Configure products. How many licenses do you need? One. Okay.
Dude, what's kind of funny for GIS, one of like the most powerful or the kind of like industry products that they use for data, like map making and data manipulation, is called Arc Pro, and it's run by this corporation called Esri, and we get like trained all the GIS majors and mapping people get trained up like in that program. Like they don't really teach us how to do anything else. But then we got into the real world, and licenses, like a business license for Esri to like have that software, is like $10,000 a year.
Really?
So, yeah, it's wild. It's like kind of like Adobe, but worse. But also my professor changed the curriculum for the capstone course this semester, which I just took, and he focused, and it was entirely in Python. Like I had never really learned Python before, and this whole semester was just about making maps with Python, because that
Oh
doesn't cost any
wow,
money.
I didn't know you
It's
can make.
crazy.
But that's cool. I didn't know you make
Yeah,
maps with Python.
yeah, it's crazy. There's like a lot of modules, that create, that can do that shit. It's weird. They're really simple and like janky ass looking and hard to get right if you don't know the
Yeah,
code, which is a pain in the ass, but it's doable. It's mostly good for like the statistical analyses and the data stuff you can do with it.
yeah. I mean, I like Python. I've been, or at least I was using it in college, just like trying to learn it, like deep learning and stuff.
Oh yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, it was pretty cool. Select employee count. It's just me. I guess this isn't like a business thing, but
Technically, you could write it off your taxes if you're making money from this podcast.
no, I'm that would be so cool, but no, I'm not. If I had more listeners, I'll add advertisements when I start having more listeners.
What kind of products would you want to advertise? Do ad read for?
I would probably advertise stuff like educational stuff, like brilliant.org. I like that site.
Yeah, you're like Curiosity Stream and that stuff.
Yeah, Curiosity Stream, just like all that, like that sort of jazz. I would honestly, I would advertise Spotify, like products that I use, probably like Spotify.
Yeah.
Coronas if I could.
Hell yeah.
Right. Maybe the Claws or Trulies.
Claw Surge.
Yeah. Well, just so you know, Ben, this episode is sponsored by White Claw. So
Nice.
I'm just kidding. All right.
That's a surge too. Those things are kind of gnarly.
Yeah, they are. So where were we? We talked about everything being on sale. Okay. All right. So we'll just move on to this next little bullet point. All right. So he shares a section of the Communist Manifesto to explain his claim that capitalist realism is not a type of realism, but rather like realism itself. So, quote, capital has drowned the most heavenly ecstasies of religious fervor, of chivalrous enthusiasm. And then I have a little side comment. I say that glad Marx doesn't know about Tinder, right? Of Philistine sentimentalism in the icy water of egotistical calculation. It has resolved personal worth into exchange value, and in place of the numberless, indefeasible chartered freedoms, has set up that single unconscionable freedom, free trade. In one word, for exploitation, veiled by religious and political illusions. It has substituted naked, shameless, direct, brutal exploitation.
Yeah, it's quite the zinger there from Mr. Marx. But yeah, I think the egotistical calculation is the really prescient part there that applies to capitalist realism. It's this overtaking of any sort of expression of joie de vivre. There's no room in society for some Ralph Waldo Emerson shit anymore. Everyone's too busy for that. There's no room to just sit around. And even more so with the age of the internet and technology and just the speed at which information is presented to us. One essay that Deleuze did that I think is really interesting was he said, no, or what is it? It's Postscript on Societies of Control. And so he basically works from this concept developed by Michel Foucault about societies of discipline. So, kind of place yourself in early 20th century, late, just industrialist capitalism, right? Fordist capitalism of assembly lines and mass production and the bell rings, you stand up, you go to the different enclosures of society. The family, there's a way you act and within that enclosure, and that's separate from the workplace, where there's there's different assumptions of roles and tone and just demeanor, separated from I don't know, the military and all these in the church and different sectors of society, right? And the kind of MO of society of discipline is that of authoritative direction from society, right? Like, do this, do that, or else you'll be punished. Whereas Deleuze, he identifies the shift from that to societies of control, where there's this sort of flattening of hierarchies, where instead before, it was like you and your coworkers and then a supervisor and a boss, there's a clear direction of power. With postmodern capitalism and the kind of breaking down of those borders, there is, that distinction isn't there anymore. And we become our own kind of, slave drivers in a way. Like we, our progress is measured by like self-assessments and logs and, cultivating a commodifiable personality and self in like the workforce. Think about LinkedIn, and instead of it being, like show up to work on time or you're fired, the kind of mindset now is, oh, I need to show up on work on time to prove I'm a valuable worker to my boss, and opportunity arises from there. And then so those sort of disciplinary fangs of society are pointed inwards and completely internalized, right?
Yeah.
And what does that do? But that it represses energies that we would direct outwards, right? And things with radical potential for change in society. Just that energy gets pointed inward and is destructive. And that's why we're all fucking depressed.
Yeah, I mean, I told you that I work remotely, right? And
that's a great example of it.
Yeah, and there's quarterly reviews that I have to fill out and say, this is what I can improve on, right? It's like I was reading through this essay and I was like, yep, I experienced all that at my job. And then you'll hear this fucking bullshit when your manager asks you, hey Greg, where do you see yourself in 5 years? And I'm just thinking, dude, I might be dead. Go fuck yourself. Stop asking me where
he sees you, though. He sees you in that same goddamn spot. He just wants to know how badly you want to get out of
there. Yeah, I know. But yeah, well, it makes people angry, right? It's sort of this like rapey sort of like the manager's like there, and that he's more powerful than you. And then like he'll say this stuff that like makes him sound super nice, but he's like saying it in such a way that he's kind of just like trying to assert his dominance in a sense. I don't know.
Right. Right. And in absence of that sort of power structure in the workplace or in society, there is still that driving, kind of disciplinary flow within society. It has to reproduce those conditions for it, but instead it's this idea, this hyper individualized and hyper fragmented, from a collective idea of a self, and how we all have to be perfect individually because there is only the individual. Margaret Thatcher, like the queen of neoliberalism, said there is no society, i.e. there is only individuals, which is a crazy thing to say because we're social creatures, right? Everything we do depends on the work of collectives on a kind of a larger, movement of people.
Yeah, I mean, there would be no podcasts if there was only individuals, right?
Yeah, I mean, think about how much labor went into all of the systems that created our phones, the development of them, the technology. That's tens of thousands of people, countless man hours, just like facilitating this interaction, right? And if you look around and think about society in terms of that, and just how much, I think Fisher calls it dead labor, is put into the objects around us. And he makes the analogy of, capitalism being a vampire and turning our dead flesh into labor, with, us having no opportunity for human fulfillment in the meantime.
Yeah, I mean, it's slavery with extra steps.
Yeah.
Well, my friend would argue that civilization itself is slavery with extra steps. But
so what's the alternative to that then?
Well, I guess the only real alternative, I guess, in my opinion, is to go back to being in tribes.
You think so? That's an interesting viewpoint, I think. Honestly, I'd like to talk about that one a little bit, because I really do understand where that sentiment comes from, like the Industrial Revolution and its consequences, etc. But think about the potential of human, technology and power,
Yeah.
brain power. Think about all the innovations that, we can create with the levels of technology we have. The problem isn't the sheer existence of those things or people, it's the direction of them and the purpose of them, right? And everything under capitalism is created for the purpose of the growth of capitalism, the ever constant expansion, right?
Yeah.
And
well, it's possible I'm being right. I'm in this bubble, right? So I'm thinking, oh, there's no alternatives to capitalism except for destroying it.
right. Yeah. And then, yeah, exactly. And
just
that's
destroying
the thing,
everything.
is we just, right. But that's the thing, though, is like, to break past that is to not stop there. It's to, challenge your brain to, think about what the future could be like, right? And,
Yeah.
We're kind of haunted by the aesthetics of the 20th century kind of utopian era. But, that's just part of the replicatory kind of culture production under capitalism, right? So the key is to push through that and truly create more, just radical concepts, ideas, just draw from the plane of immanence, as Deleuze would call it, just to progress our knowledge and understanding.
Yeah.
Just things can't be stagnant forever.
No, they can't. Okay, so I have this note here in relation to where he was saying everything is like becoming an artifact. I know we kind of went on. We talked about a lot of stuff like in between that.
Yeah, we went on a little tangent on there.
But I wanted to say that with everything becoming an artifact, this kind of relates to this actually relates more to his later chapter about all that is solid melts into PR. But most of this capital world, it's all about images, right? It's all about marketing. It's all about advertising. It's all about how things are represented. And then I say that this sort of echoes David Foster Wallace from E Unibus Plurum, when he's just, or like regarding being viewers and watchers, right? Fisher, he makes a claim that capitalism is what is left when beliefs and customs are abandoned. We are just left with spectators and people scrambling through artifacts, right? And capitalism moves people from experiencing things firsthand to experiencing like a simulation of those things, right? And the real thing, it's just kind of like in the past, right? Like with like Tinder, right? Like we want love, right? Okay, yeah, let me get me some love on Tinder, right? You know, that's not fucking real.
No, it's what it's Baudrillard. He wrote a book called Simulacrum Simulation, where he talks about that kind of exact thing, where he was an early semiotician, so they study signs, right, as they communicate meaning, right, kind of like a linguistics of images and structures of thought. But so essentially he came up with the idea of a simulacra, which is a representation that is so removed, a sign that is so removed from what it's originally trying to signify that it doesn't have any relation to the original. So think about like so I guess we'll think about, oh shit, what the fuck? So sorry about that.
What?
For example, I just dropped something.
Okay.
for example, though, think about like, so if we're starting at the reality, or the real thing on the ground, you could okay, so let's use like Nazi Germany, or like Hitler, for example, or Nazi Germany rather, and those sort of aesthetics that is represented in Star Wars. There's metaphor, there's allegory, there's a reference to that reality, right? But Star Wars becomes its own thing. That representation becomes its own thing, and then you get products that mimic or are representations of Star Wars, right? And then so that's how you arrive at a Funko Pop of Darth Vader. And that's the sort of just progression of abstraction and self-referentiality that commodification does to images and signs and how we think of things.
Yeah, I will mention one thing, is that there, like, correlation doesn't equal causation, right? And sometimes I wonder, well, maybe we're confusing the fact that, we're pretty late in the future. We're in 2022. There's 8 billion people. We've thought of so many things so far. Is it possible that with there being so many people and us having thought of so many things, that maybe it kind of muddies the water so much that it makes it more and more difficult to think of new things?
Yeah, I agree with that. And that's especially kind of pertinent too with the sort of postmodern idea that this rejection of grand narratives, right? The rejection of these, just narratives of history and thought. You could think of like American nationalism and manifest destiny as a grand narrative. All these, the 20th century is full of them. The model of fascism, or the model of Stalinism, or the liberal humanism as it made itself into the global capital finance system we see today. And postmodernism rejects those, right? And then fragments us into individuals, right? We're hyper atomized because there's no grand thing keeping it all together, right? You're into I'm sure Nietzsche has a lot to say about that. The God is dead. That's what I understand he's kind of getting at there. And so I guess, how do you break free from that? How do you kind of recoalesce people with so many back into a form of action that would necessitate, or not necessitate, but rather lead to a shift in power structures and foundations of society? And that requires a grand narrative, right? It requires a sort of overarching idea of what is possible from something that doesn't seem so.
Yes, because people need, you can't just say, yeah, there's greener pastures over somewhere. They're somewhere. You have to point them in the right direction.
Yeah.
That they need like an image to go to, right?
Right.
Okay. And then did you you just explained your note, right? Or did you at all?
Oh no, I can go over that too.
Yeah, I feel like that's a pretty good note there.
Yeah,
when I said beliefs and customs are abandoned.
Right. Yeah. So I think it's rather that instead of capitalism being the result of us abandoning sort of belief and tradition in that sort of sense, rather they are subsumed into capitalism's like logic. They're not these tangible things that we leave behind, but rather they're co-opted and territorialized, as Deleuze would put it, by capital. And it's those kind of flows of energy from those are recuperated to serve its own reproductive interests, right? Because if we want to get into Althusser, he wrote a really interesting paper called Ideology and Ideological State Apparatuses, which basically just talks about, ideology in the Marxist sense of, the ruling kind of system, like capitalism is the ruling ideology, and it has to constantly reproduce the conditions for its own reproduction, right? So it has to, territorialize the flows in society to its own ends. And that's where, branding and marketing and the kind of commodification of every aspect of our lives comes into that.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. It's all kind of just,
It's constantly in motion too.
Yeah.
Right. That's a big Deleuzian kind of axiom, is that everything is constantly in motion. And instead of there being these, instead of thinking about structures of society and concepts as these sort of Aristotelian, perfect form, which is imitated, branching out from a center thing, he uses the term of rhizomatic tendencies, rhizomes being, this just sort of web network with no central node or axis that everything just kind of operates on and connects with, like a neural network, or like a mycological soil, the little white things you see under trees, like the fungus.
Yeah, it kind of grows. And I guess in a sense that kind of relates to this note where he compares capitalism to John Carpenter's The Thing. And there's also something that you really brought up when you said that capitalism is totalitarianism. It's like this all-pervading force, right? He says, quote, "It's a monstrous, infinitely plastic entity capable of metabolizing and absorbing anything with which it comes in contact," right? Like everything's for sale. Oh honey, everything's for sale, right?
Yep. Even anti-capitalism. And I think he gets into that a bit later in the book or the notes.
Yeah.
So we can hold off on that till there. But yeah, it is truly just a amorphous plastic thing that is constantly latching onto just traditional, or just flows in society, and repurposing it for its own ends.
Yeah, it reminds me of the people who they'll sell Oregon Air for $200 in a bottle. It's just it's just an empty bottle that's in Oregon, and they close it, right?
Well, you're buying the novelty there. You're in on the joke. It's tongue in cheek.
All right, Ben. Well, I'm looking forward to buying a $500 bottle of Montana Air if you got it.
Yeah, it's getting to be fire season, so I do it now before later.
No, it'll be more authentic. I'll get you some Idaho Air, and yeah,
that's true.
Okay, then I like that he brings up Nietzsche a few times.
Yeah, Deleuze loves Nietzsche. He has some really interesting readings of Nietzsche.
Okay, so Nietzsche's Untimely Meditations. So he brings up Untimely Meditations, where N writes that the oversaturation of an age with history, where people are basically just being taught all this old stuff way too much, right? It leads an age into a dangerous mood of, quote, leads an age into a dangerous mood of irony in regard to itself, and subsequently into the even more dangerous mood of cynicism. And that's 100% true. I mean, we get taught history every year throughout our entire schooling, right? And we usually get taught the same shit over and over again. It gets a little bit more complicated as you go, but I don't know if you did you have Mr. Sturmer for history?
No, I had Borowski.
Okay, that's rough, man.
Borowski. Nah, he was great. He's a goober.
Okay, because Mr. Sturmer was an amazing history teacher. He would just tell us everything, man. But yeah, this oversaturation makes people cynical. They'll go, they'll hear all this stuff, and they'll go tear down statues and.
Well, I would disagree. I would say that those people who are tearing down statues aren't affected by the sort of detached spectatorialism that Nietzsche's kind of Last Man is talking about, that Fisher is referencing. I think rather it's the idea that the person who just sort of who watches the news and is up to date on politics, but if you ask him about what can be done or what can be changed. He's just like, it's just
Yeah.
he's really only engaging in it with just a pure
Okay.
sense of irony and detachment.
Because
that's a production of that being the only outlet really for change, right? Because how much can you really change your environment politically as an American? If you can, on like local levels and stuff, you can have some tangible results, but overall, like it's just kind of general tendency of policy goes towards the interests of the elite and whoever is in the pockets of boards of directors in the government.
Well, I think you're right, because it's like, I mean, how much longer are we going to go on worshiping these guys? Right?
Yeah.
Like forever? Are we going to worship them forever? Or are we going to eventually make something for ourselves? Right?
I mean, I bet the peasants thought that they were going to worship the king forever too. So, but that changed. It's like, in the current moment of a historical era, it's hard for people to, conceptualize what comes next until it happens, right? Like, I don't think you could have a member of the gentry in medieval times could have predicted like industrial capitalism, or even just like a journeyman guild system that happened afterwards, right? We're all embedded and ingrained into our own sort of society's ideology that we just don't have the tools, like thought wise, language wise, to even conceive of something new. Yeah. Because that comes with it as it changes and as it moves.
So I'm going to skip this note I. I'm going to move on to note J, just because we kind of talked about that. Okay, so this is kind of something that we brought up. This is kind of like when I was somewhat arguing against tearing down statues, and then you kind of brought up, well, like, why not? Like, what's wrong with tearing down?
Yeah, what do they do? What is the purpose of the statue?
And it says, yeah, I mean, what is the purpose of the statue? Like, okay, and then Fisher talks about how people don't rebel anymore. Mm-hmm. Instead, they participate in trends. They participate in, they'll put a picture of a black screen on their Instagram to show that
slap an infographic on their story.
Yeah, they'll say, they'll put up signs that say Black Lives Matter, but do they actually do anything? Do they actually even do anything other than that? No, they just like participate in the trend, right? Like, okay, everyone else is doing it, so I'll do it, right? Then he says, quote, Kurt Cobain knew that he was just another piece of the spectacle, that nothing runs better on MTV than a protest against MTV. Knew that every move was a cliche scripted in advance. Knew that even realizing it is a cliche. He brings up Jameson, who says that Cobain found himself in a, quote, world in which stylistic innovation is no longer possible, where all that is left is the imitate dead styles, to speak through the masks and with the voices of the styles in the imaginary museum, end quote. So then I say, I bring up in the notes, I say that Pink Floyd would say they were all just another brick in the wall, right? Like Kurt Cobain, he's just another brick in the wall. He's just another guy who sings really good. People really like him. And so he's just a product of he's basically the product of the music producers and all the people who, are sitting pretty on a lot of money because they're using these artists for their talent, right?
Yeah.
It's like being stuck in a television show where you just can't escape being the character, right? You're stuck being Truman in the Truman Show. There's nothing new, and it's impossible to make anything new. You're just playing the same old tunes over and over again.
Or even if you do something that's truly new and creative, it's not going to be able to hold purchase in, this sort of media reproduction of society.
Well, it took Like,
or if it does, it becomes recuperated by capitalism. So we were
yeah,
talking about BLM and those sort of activist movements, and what happens within those is, more radical elements, the ones that were shown as looters on TV and stuff. Those are expunged from the movement as soon as possible, right? Because it's bad PR, it's bad image, bad optics. Because that's all that matters, right?
yeah,
Because BLM, unfortunately, all you can really do, or like within that structure, is policy and legislature, and that requires PR and image and good, standing with the authorities, and that it doesn't engender any sort of really radical potential, and that's capitalism's neoliberal capitalism's job, is to suppress action and to
yeah.
just shift the frame to simply believing, and seeing.
Yeah, don't act. And I don't know if you ever watched the plastic pills video on where he talked about like the zombie ideology. Did you watch
Yeah,
that?
that's a good one.
Yeah.
It's a good analysis.
Yeah. And he brings up the idea that they will tell us, like the people in power, they'll tell us, like be civil, right? Just use your words, not your body. But it's like, okay, like we've been using our words for this long, but guess what? Using our words is jack shit.
Right, and civil discourse only happens between two equal parties, right? If there's a
Yeah.
power structure, then discourse does not provide an equal, you know, ground for change.
Yeah.
And it hasn't in history. History is driven by movements of masses,
Yeah.
enacting a sort of collective will. It doesn't happen like in the movies, as much as Marvel wants to bash into our brains.
Yeah. So let's move on to this chapter 2.
Yeah.
Um, what if you held a protest and everyone came? Right. And I'll have to, you know what, Ben, I'll pose that question to you actually. What would be your answer to that question?
If you held a protest and everyone came,
Yeah.
um, well, nothing would change, because even the people in power would show up, because and then he goes into, because the point he's making there is that anti-capitalism at this point is, um, it only reinforces capitalism, right?
Yeah.
Because it's so easily commodifiable. It has a identifiable, image, branding, appeal, edginess kind of thing that people can latch onto, right? In
Yeah.
movies where, there's movies abound where the corporation is the bad guy, like in Terminator, Alien, Wall-E. They're all the cause of destruction, but we consume those media and we acknowledge that, we recognize that, and we feel good that we understand it and can express that. But that
Yes.
movie is concluded in an arc. 90 minutes later, it's done, the lights turn on, and you can say, oh, at least good thing that the Wayland Corp doesn't really exist, or oh, good thing my boss isn't as bad as lumber, office space. And you can kind of continue, right? It's these just bits of consumption at this point only. And same with the BLM, that kind
Yeah.
of naive or recuperated activism of just sharing images on Instagram or placations that don't really change anything.
Yeah. Or even, well, I really noticed this like in the COVID-19 epidemic. Like people will, like they'll go to a restaurant wearing a mask, right? And like, yeah, like go for it. But the thing is, the mask itself is only really effective up to like 20 minutes, right? While you're sitting in a space.
Yeah.
So they'll wear the mask almost to justify going to the restaurant. But in reality, if they really didn't want to spread COVID, or if they didn't want to get COVID, then they just wouldn't go to the restaurant at all.
Right. It's an image. It displays
Yeah.
values, and those are the things we attach to ourselves. in terms of brands and commodities as well, but also in terms of movements and just, ideology in general. Yeah, I don't know. I don't really have much to say about that, the mask stuff in relation to that, but
Well, I do have to mention
it
another
definitely.
thing
Yeah, go ahead.
especially with like Christianity. People will say that they're Christian, and by saying that they're Christian, that somehow makes them a good person, right? I mean, this has been something that has probably been going on since year one, right? It's
Right.
like,
Yeah.
oh,
It's kind
I'm
of
Christian, I
ingrained
follow
into
Jesus, right? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So let's okay. So he gives, I'm gonna skip that part A because you kind of like, you basically talked about that. So he gives a Zizek quote, which reads, quote, "Then today's society must appear post-ideological. The prevailing ideology is that of cynicism. People no longer believe in ideological truth. They do not take ideological propositions seriously. The fundamental level of ideology, however, is not of an illusion masking the real state of things, but that of an unconscious fantasy structuring our social reality itself. And at this level, we are, of course, far from being a post-ideological society. Cynical distance is just one way to blind ourselves to the structural power of ideological fantasy. Even if we do not take the things seriously, even if we keep an ironical distance, we are still doing them." Unquote. So I think this is kind of his thing. Oh, perfect. I say this in a sense, we were fooling ourselves. We say things like ghosts aren't real, yet we're deathly afraid of the dark, right? Like we say these things, but our words don't match our actions, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I know what you mean. I think you could make the allegory too there of money. We all understand it's just a representation that, a piece of paper doesn't actually have that value, but a representation of. But regardless of it being, real or not, we act as if it is, and we act on it. Just like with, we were talking about earlier, or no, I was listening to one of your older podcasts. You were talking to a guy about the free will kind of debate, and
Yeah.
it doesn't matter if we have free will or not. The matter of the fact is we act as if we do, and that's the thing with people.
Exactly.
And the thing with social constructions like that isn't to say like, like, oh, like that's a social construct. Money is a social construct, therefore it doesn't matter. No, recognizing it as a social construct gives us the ability to understand that we can change it, right? We can.
Yeah.
It's malleable. It's not a set in stone sort of just thing that exists. It's a product of thought.
Yeah. And yes, it's a social construct. And because it's a social construct, we can reconstruct it, right?
Right.
And also, I also want to say that just because something is a social construct, it doesn't mean that it's not real. It's super real. It's like pervades our, like, yeah, capitalism is just a social construct, right? But guess what? It pervades everything. It's our whole, it's what our whole civilization is founded on. Okay. So let's see. Okay. So Zizek, according to Fisher, Zizek says, so long as we believe in our hearts that capitalism is bad, we are free to continue to participate in capitalist exchange. So we kind of went over that. And then I basically brought up the same example earlier. Meaningless token. Okay, then yeah, we basically, you just talked about that. Okay.
We're getting ahead of ourselves.
Oh, I see. I was like up here, then you were like looking down, and then you brought, I don't know, maybe. Okay, so Fisher makes the argument that many protests only exist because of capitalism. Okay, yeah, he brings up the, what is it, the Live 8
the
concert.
Live 8 concert, yeah.
Yeah. And like, you've seen the Queen movie, right? Bohemian Rhapsody.
Yeah.
Yeah, they do
that has the scene at the end with the Live 8 concert. Yeah, that's an interesting thing because that predates our time to learn about that. Just all the most popular bands at the time had a big concert to I guess raise awareness for Africa and like,
And they're all
but what does
millionaires.
that right? But what does that do? Everybody knows that Africa is like starving, but they create this spectacle to center that on, and that spectacle is just, it's a concert.
Yeah. Have you ever read Ishmael?
No.
I bring this up so much on this podcast, this book. But well, it's because like so many of the ideas that get discussed on the podcast, it just reminds me of Ishmael.
Yeah.
So I won't go over what the book is, but this guy, well, technically this talking gorilla is talking about how like we'll give food to starving people in Africa. Then what happens? When we give them food, they make more babies, right? And then their population increases. Then after the population increases, more people start to starve. So then we need to give them even more food than the last year, right? And when we give them even more food, guess what? They make more babies. And then we have to give them even more food the next year. So like the thing is, a lot of this stuff, like a lot of the solutions that we have to our problems, they just create more problems basically.
Right. At least under the current system.
Yes. And this Live 8 concert, I mean, it is in a sense, it's a quote unquote solution, but it's just further contributing to like the problems that it's producing, right?
Right. Just consumption.
Yeah, consumption. Okay. So what is this? Fisher quote, what needs to be kept in mind is that both capitalism is a hyper abstract impersonal structure and there would be nothing without our cooperation. Okay. It's an abstract parasite, an insatiable vampire, zombie maker, but the living flesh it converts, the dead labor is ours. Okay, yeah, you brought that up. Yeah, it's just kind of
great line.
It's just this freaking, well, yeah, I mean, like we were saying earlier, I mean, we're just like, we're the fuel for the machine. We're the zombies eating our own flesh, basically, in a sense. Okay, I'm just going to move on to chapter 3, I think.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll just do this till 7. Does that work for you?
Yeah, sounds good.
Another 30 minutes. Okay.
Chapter or maybe like 15 more minutes. I kind of got some. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that works. We'll just go over a little bit of this chapter, and then, or maybe we'll zoom through it. I don't know. All right. Chapter 3, Capitalism and the Real. Okay. Quote, capitalist realism, as I understand it, cannot be confined to art or to the quasi-propagandistic way in which advertising functions. It is more like a pervasive atmosphere, conditioning not only the production of culture, but also the regulation of work and education, and acting as a kind of invisible barrier constraining thought and action.
Yeah, I think that sentence kind of sums up the whole book right there.
Yeah.
Got all the elements. I think that's what I was trying to get at earlier, but
yeah,
the idea that it's just a pervasive sort of
force.
Just force, exactly.
Yeah. All right, then let's see. How can capitalist realism be challenged when stating that capitalism leads to suffering only reinforces it? Okay. Okay, yeah, we kind of talked about that. Okay, realistic is defined by a series of political determinations. Okay, Fisher, quote, over the past 30 years, capitalist realism has successfully installed a business ontology, which is simply obvious that everything in society, including healthcare and education, should be run as a business, right? This is that sort of like realistic like attitude that I was saying earlier, where it's kind of like in my mind, when you say that you're realistic, it means to me that you're just closed-minded and you can't think of anything else.
Yeah. What do you mean? I'm just being realistic.
Yeah.
Can't do that.
Yeah, it's like oh, like, you know, like how else are we going to run our healthcare system? What,
Yeah,
yeah, go ahead.
I think that the business ontology term he posits is a really interesting one, right? That everything that a business is the sort of perfect way to run things or administer a system, as we've been kind of coached by society. Like, do you remember when Trump was running and everybody who supported him was like, "Oh, it's gonna be great. He's gonna run the country like a business." It's like I guess, but also, corporations are run centrally, so maybe it'd be a bit more Stalinistic than they would like. It's just
Yeah,
centrally regulated like a true business, but um, I don't think that's what they mean when they were talking about that. But yeah, I think this is really one of the key kind of foundations for societal ills that we kind of suffer today is this idea that everything should be run as a business because
yeah,
in the 20th century, where the welfare state and the sort of social democratic states in Western Europe and in the US too, kind of built themselves up, right? um, England and the US and most European countries had a pretty robust welfare system and social safety net until the 80s with Thatcher and Reagan, the sort of neoliberal era of replacing the state functions with private interests, right? And they
yeah,
wreaked absolute havoc on the world doing that. That's a whole other podcast we could go into.
yeah.
Want to talk about the CIA a little bit, etc. But the fact and the
Little
insidious thing that
Kaczynski
happens
action.
too, yeah. Well, the insidious thing that happens is um, they defund, like, so for example in England the NHS, the National Health Service,
Yeah,
was sort of the crown jewel of social democratic safety nets. Every British person was proud of it. It was just a part of national identity. Like, there's a problem with you health wise and you went there and you fixed it and it was free. There's nothing, no hassle. It wasn't weird, bureaucratic mess. But with the neoliberals, when they came into power, they began to slowly gut those programs, implement austerity measures. Right, they would look at economic problems like inflation or um, whatnot, and say we need to cut government spending here. We're in debt, etc. And then so they would cut those programs one by one, a little bit like death by a thousand cuts kind of thing. And then when the system would start to malfunction because it's been gutted and destroyed from the inside, basically, then they would say, "Oh, well, look at how inefficient these state-run systems are. That's why capital or private capital should take
yeah,
the reins." And that's their sort of MO there.
yeah. Like when they were like trying to get rid of the post office.
Yeah,
It's like, wait, what? We can't send
that
mail
we
to each
need
other.
that.
Like, what the fuck? Get rid of the post office. Like, what kind of shit is that? It costs like $10 to mail a letter with UPS. You expect me to, and it's only like a couple cents for a, yeah.
Yeah, and
Um,
America has an exceptional like postal service compared to other countries as well too. It's such a vast country with so much shit
yeah,
flying around. We've got it down.
yeah, we do. So I'm gonna move on to this letter E. Um, he he gives a quote from Zupancic, maybe, regarding ideology. Quote, "It's not some kind of natural way associated with how things are. The reality principle itself is ideologically mediated. One could even claim that it constitutes the highest form of ideology, the ideology that presents itself as empirical fact or biological economic necessity, and that we tend to perceive as non-ideological. It is precisely here that we should be most alert to the functioning of ideology," unquote. So yeah, in other words, we should be most suspicious of those things that are regarded as empirical fact, where people are saying, um, this is 100% true. You can't deny that.
Yeah,
Where people get
yeah,
angry at you if you doubt it. If you say,
yeah,
well, what if it's like this? Shut up.
yeah. I mean, we've been coached our whole lives to believe in scientific empiricism as the only truth, that
Yeah.
if it can't be proven there, it doesn't exist or it's not real.
Yeah.
And I mean, look at like when people talk about like gender and trans people, for example, people will say like, oh, it's not natural, like, biology doesn't work that way. And there's just this stubborn kind of you know clutching to those ideas, that system, that formulation of thought, that they can't expand it further into the structures of society
Yeah.
and ideological functions and all these sort of abstract intangible things that do govern society, but and the world, and I guess you could say necessitate truth also. So to ignore that is either naive or just ignorant.
Yeah, it's like, like, sorry, we need to stay within these lines. We can't be drawing outside of them. And it's sort of, I mean, there's like the thing, I mean, I won't give any examples of it happening today. But in the past, we have, Galileo being called a heretic and sentenced to, like home prison, basically.
Mm-hmm.
There's all sorts of examples of people being heretics, of heretics just being sentenced to prison or to death or being stoned to death or
Right,
whatever.
because they represent a negation to the system, and a contradiction that the system would have to struggle to overcome, and it's
Yeah.
easier to just remove that.
Yes, it's easier to just eliminate it. Yeah.
But it still must face those contradictions and resolve itself regardless. So
Yeah,
it's just a cruel apparatus.
yeah, it is. And I mean, this is something that like Vladimir Putin's doing right now, right? He's throwing people in jail that disagree with the war.
Hey, we do that too.
Well, yeah,
Don't you
yeah.
forget it. It's just
No,
been a while since we had a real war.
yeah, no, you're right. You're right. Yeah, and if you don't want to fight in the war, you get sent to jail, right? If you don't want to fight the war, like, okay, going to jail, see ya. Yeah, but oh yeah. So Fisher, he gives it a distinction between the real and reality, with quote, the real is what any reality must suppress. Indeed, reality constitutes itself through just this repression. The real is an unrepresentable X, a traumatic void that can only be glimpsed in the fractures and inconsistencies in the field of apparent reality. So one strategy against capitalist realism could involve invoking the real underlying the reality that capitalism presents to us, unquote. So this is kind of something that I'm a little bit confused on. Do you understand it?
Yeah, so what Fisher's pulling from here is Lacanian psychoanalysis.
Okay.
I think it's Jacques Lacan, was his
Okay.
name. His name's Lacan. But he was a French psychoanalyst with Deleuze and Guattari in the kind of post May 68 revolution in France. And that's where a lot
Okay.
of this sort of post-structuralist thought comes from. And so the real is a psychoanalytic term that Lacan uses as, I like to think of it as, are you familiar with like Lovecraft, like Cthulhu, that sort of mythos?
I've
That sort
kind
of
of
horror
heard about
genre.
it, but
Yeah,
yes, it's kind of like that supernatural, like,
just incomprehensible
yeah,
madness inducing, just
yeah.
something that our brains just can't resolve,
Hmm.
can't understand or overcome. And that sort of anxiety about that, um, you know, bubbles up to the surface in psychoanalysis and in capitalism as well, with Fisher's quote here. Um, but I need to read more Lacan because it's really interesting.
Okay.
And Slavoj Žižek is a big Lacanian, and I'm a big Slavoj guy. So
Okay.
I need to get into really dive deep there at some point.
Oh yeah. So he brings up climate change and natural disasters, and that like if there were to be something huge, like catastrophic, that finally happened to us, we would be in the real, right? Like our whole reality would slip away from us, right? And that's, I could only imagine that's something that's happened to people who live in Ukraine right now, right? Or people who have lived in Iraq for the past like millennia, right? Just people
Yeah.
constantly coming in and destroying their country.
Yeah, and the fact that the force, the malicious force there is just so far removed and distant from the individual that there's
Yeah,
really nothing you can do. It's just an unstoppable force, right? That you can't.
yeah,
There's no way you can preserve your previous habits and ways of life,
yeah,
and that's what that's what invokes anxiety when we are presented with the real.
yeah. And if,
And also, I'm gonna go on another tangent here because
yeah, go for it.
with you know technology and just the constant stream of information, um,
Yes,
we've been inoculated with this sort of constant state of anxiety because we're always plugged into just the horrors of the world, right? Something
yeah,
bad happens across the world, we know about it, and
mm-hmm.
the more you pay attention, the more just like shitty it looks, right? The more
Yeah,
conflict, the more terror, the more cruelty just exists, and that's just kind of peering into
yeah.
the real. That is like that exists out there. All these things that would horrify you
Okay, well,
exist, but you just don't confront them.
okay,
And
well, I agree with you, but at the same time, I also think it's like, yeah, we're looking, we have technology, we can look at, what's happening in Ukraine. We see, oh, wow, that's like the real world, like this crazy shit happened. But it's also like, you look at that, then you turn your phone off and you look around, oh, wow, it's a beautiful day. Sun is shining. Like in a sense, I think um, the real is actually looking away from your phone and seeing like the world that you're in right now and really noticing like what's going on, right? Like, okay,
right, yeah,
sun is
but
shining.
I don't think that's the way Lacan is using the real. I think that's
Yeah, no, I know what you mean.
he has
Yeah,
his own sort of schema of concepts and terms he uses.
yeah, like the
But I know
the
what
reality is
I know
that we're
what
all
you
gonna die.
yeah,
Yeah,
and that's part of the real as well. Just this
yeah.
sort of incomprehensible grandness.
Okay. And then did you mention your note? Not to mention political disruption of people's consumption. Yeah, like it. Okay, if something's done about this stuff, then it would just make it too real. Then you say that it would also just, like it would get us out of our, it would disrupt our like comfort zones, basically.
Right.
Um,
Yeah. And yeah, that sort of confrontation is not something that we're acclimated to, especially within consumer society, right? Any sort of
yeah,
rocking of the boat, rousing us from our slumber or stupor is deeply stressful.
sorry, my mom was there. Sorry. Okay. So let's just finish up this chapter, I guess. We're almost
Yeah.
there. All right. He then brings up mental health in that, okay, he says that it's mental health isn't the individual's problem. Well, it is the individual's problem, but it's not the cause of it. Like we're not all crazy because we're individuals. We're crazy because of the system that we live in, right?
Right.
It's a political problem. Mental
Right.
disorders are the highest in the most capitalist societies, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is where I really like Deleuze's work and Lacan too, the kind of French psychoanalysts, because they broke from um, like this kind of Western psychiatric associations, the kind of current conception of mental illness, kind of as we know it today. That sort of coalition, they were kind of a radical break from that because they argue that, or at least Deleuze in his kind of magnum opus, Anti-Oedipus, argues that our sort of conception of the mind and the unconscious has been hyper individualized as capitalism does. The blame for our problems is, strictly chemical imbalances that can be mediated with drugs. And obviously everybody knows that this isn't, in turn, like deep down, people understand that there's larger, wider factors in this. And then even to the focus on what is they call it the Oedipal triangle, and that is just the kind of like mother, father, self, family, and the sort of reasons for mental illness, I guess you could say, is just contained within that triangle in terms of traditional psychoanalysis. But their book seeks to sort of expand that, and their work seeks to sort of expand that and work with it from a more structural perspective.
Well, like as human beings with brains, like what do our brains do? They take in all the input from our surroundings, and then they put out an output into thoughts, right, and our actions. So with that said, cause of mental disorders, it's not just your family and what's in your mind, it's every single thing that comes into your brain can potentially be a cause of whatever ails you, right? And if we live in a society where there's an all-pervading force of, like, say, capitalism, right? That's how our entire framework of civilization is founded upon. That's how our entire environment that we get all of our stimuli from is founded upon. Then, yeah, of course, mental health disorders are very much a systemic problem, not just an individual problem. So, and
that's probably a good place to leave it off. It's a good finishing point.
Yeah, we can leave it off there. Yeah.
Cool.
Sounds good. Cool. Well, thank you so much, Ben. That was awesome.
Yeah, it was good talking, man. I'm excited for part 2.
Yeah,
I'll let you know when I'm free.
Sounds good, dude.
We made it a little more than a third of the way through. It's pretty good.
Yeah, sometimes it happens that way. That's okay.
Yeah, a lot to talk about though.
All right, cool. Well, you really know your shit, man. So
glad to hear it. You're good. Glad to dialogue with somebody. It's productive.
Cool. All right. Well, you have a good night.
Yeah, you too. See you, man.
See ya.